Elon Musk is one example of literally millions of Americans who have come up with really cool solutions to environmental challenges. So that's not going to happen if people think that they don't have a role in this and if they think that they should just be dead. Our generation, the millennials and Gen Z, feel so hopeless and fearful for the future because they feel like climate change is going to basically destroy our lives.
Welcome to another episode of Manhattan Insights. I'm Daniel DiMartino. I'm a graduate fellow at the Manhattan Institute focused on immigration. And I'm here with my friend, Benji Backer, who is the founder of the American Conservation Coalition and also the author of a new book that just came out today, The Conservative Environmentalist. And I'm very excited to have this conversation about environmentalism, what your book is about, climate change, conservation, what it's all about with this issue.
Well, it's great to be here. It's been, really fun to be your friend for a while, and you've done incredible work on a different issue, immigration, obviously, and also just the topic of freedom in general, which intersects a lot with my love of the environment, because I believe in a lot of the principles that you fight for on other issues, I think need to be applied to the environment. So it's going to be a great conversation.
Okay, so tell me about this. So how did you come to care about the environment in the first place?
Well, I think just like everyone, even if they are skeptical of the issue, we all have a deep connection to the environment in our own unique ways. And for me, that was growing up in Wisconsin, in the North Woods of Wisconsin. There are some amazing lakes. And, I'd sit on the dock with my grandpa and go fishing or just watch the birds fly. And, there's just a peacefulness of a place like that, lake or a forest or, growing up across the street from a farm. I mean, even just farmland, there's just so much beauty in this country. And I fell in love with it at a young age and fell in love with wildlife and the ecosystem and how much we rely on that ecosystem to survive. And, one change in the ecosystem can have ripple effects to all of us. And so it just was something that I cared a lot about. And I started getting really into hiking and skiing and a lot of other kind of fun activities when I was in middle school and high school. And I was also active in conservative politics at the same time and, felt like those two things were at odds.
What do you think were at odds? I think that, the issue is that when we talk about the environment, the first thing that probably comes to people's minds is climate change.
Right.
And Greta Thunberg, right. And they want to take our gas cars and they want to take our gas stoves and they just really want to take things away from us. Right.
That's what it feels like, and that actually is kind of what environmentalism has become. But it didn't used to be that way. And I think, as someone who testified with Greta, I think that her intentions aside, she could be very well intended, I don't know, but her intentions aside, she has made this issue harder to solve and turned off so many people and proposed policies that are incredibly damaging. And environmentalism used to be a topic where when you said the environment, the first words that came to mind weren't climate change and Greta Thunberg. It was your backyard, your neighborhood, your community, your love of the trees and the forests and the oceans. And now you get this political visceral reaction from people when they hear it, if they don't buy into it. And if they do, you still get a visceral reaction of like, the world's ending and I'm upset too. So like it's become this like very toxic issue, no pun intended, that's made environmentalism basically a partisan or tribal issue. And I have this crazy belief that it doesn't have to be that way. Environmentalism should be about the environment. Environmentalism should be about the places that we love and conserving those places for future generations, and not about crazy policies that rip people's livelihoods away for the sake of the environment, but actually to protect the environment in a way that also benefits people.
Yeah. Well, in the Manhattan Institute, we focus a lot on cities, and obviously nature is part of the cities, and having a place like Central Park is really part of the environment. And how do we maintain it well? There's a lot of solutions. Like most people don't know, for example, Bryant Park, which we're very close from here, is privately managed, even though it's a public park.
I didn't know that.
And it used to be completely destroyed when it was publicly managed. They gave it to actually private actors that could profit from the park, and now the park is the best that there is in the city.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, environmentalism too.
Yeah, it's a perfect story. I had no idea that Bryant Park was privately managed, but it's a perfect story. I mean, Ted Turner, the founder of CNN and the owner of CNN, Turner Broadcasting, he owns this massive plot of land in Montana that is privately owned by him. And it is like the size of a national park. And it is one of the most pristine places in the entire West because he's actively managing it to a place where the wildlife and the ecosystems can thrive. And when the United States started working on rehabbing the bison population after we kind of destroyed it a few centuries ago, they are basically all rehabbing on his plot of land because it's so healthy and it's such a great ecosystem. So when you look at farmers and foresters and other conservationists at a much more micro level, private landowners tend to be the best stewards of the environment. Now, that's not always true because you can have companies going in and saying, we're just going to tap into all these resources and then leave and then sell the land or ditch it and just, have the profits of the land. But when it comes down to typical just land conservation and keeping a place wild and healthy and safe and clean, that is something that private landowners do super well.
Yeah, well, and in economics, this is one of the main things that they teach us, right? And it's that there's the collective ownership problem where if a resource is it's a limited resource,
Right.
is collectively owned, it's going to be depleted because if nobody actually owns it, there's no incentive to conserve it.
Right.
So, which is where the whole thing of actually private property or free markets have
Property
a
rights.
potential to
Right.
conserve our environment.
If we didn't have property rights and we didn't have property, that we owned as individuals, we wouldn't care that much about the environment at all. We have a duty to protect the property that we own, right? And we also we not only have a duty, but we also benefit if it is. And the government does not. And you have people, especially when it comes to public lands, thousands of miles away, telling you what you should and shouldn't do with that, which ends up just doing nothing and letting it kind of just sit there, which sounds good in theory to just let some place, thrive without humans touching it. But in practice, that means worse forest fires. In practice, that means an overpopulation of one species leading to the decimation of another. What that looks like in practice is a whole host of, basically, because we brought some invasive species from overseas, those can just go gangbusters in these places if you don't take action in public lands, because all these bad things can happen because you're not intervening, you're not conserving. And I talk about in the book that there's basically a conservationist or a preservationist mindset. And most of the time, a conservation mindset of managing an ecosystem so that it can thrive and be in balance, because we humans are on this planet making it imbalanced, so we should help balance it out, is way better than letting it continue to be imbalanced and go in the wrong direction, which is what happens when you preserve instead of conserve.
That's very interesting because it kind of echoes what Pope Francis has talked about in regards to the environment, that humans are stewards of the planet.
Right.
That's God's duty for us
Right.
on Earth, one of them. And in reality, it's that, right? It's just different, conservation from preservation. The modern environmentalist movement, leftist, they're not really, their goal is different from ours. Their goal is to minimize human impact to the point of really extinguishing the human species.
Yep.
They think the planet would be better off if humans didn't inhabit. We want to maximize the environment for our benefit.
Right, exactly. And to do that, you also need the environment to be around in future generations. And that's what these extinctionists don't realize, is that just because we want humans to thrive doesn't mean we also don't want the environment to thrive. And if you want humanity to thrive truly, and you're not just selfish and you want it to only be in your lifetime and no one else's, then you also want the environment to be protected for future generations. But if you have an extinctionist mindset, I mean, first of all, humans aren't going to go away. We're not going to go extinct. Sorry, by our own choice, at least. And so in a reality that humans exist, humans should flourish. Humans should have the opportunity to have a better life than their parents and grandparents lived. And the environment has to be healthy for that to happen. But I believe in humanity, and I believe in people making this world a better place and having purpose and a mission and a life worth living. And killing off our species to save the planet is not the way forward. So then the only other way, truly, is to keep us in harmony with the environment, which we have to use to survive, the resources that it provides. So if we're going to use the resources that it provides, then we need to manage them to the best of our ability. And that, again, is going back to that conservation mindset.
No, my favorite genre of the left-wing environmentalism is all the feel-good measures that really hurt our environment. And my favorite one is from a book I read a long time ago. I think the title is For Your Own Good. You guys should check it out. It's about tax policies in general. And one of them was the tax on plastic bags, which here in New York City, it's really also a ban on plastic bags. And then they charge you. That we also have the ban on plastic straws. And how those reusable bags that they make us use actually hurt the environment more, because you would have to reuse them thousands of times in order for it to be better than plastic.
Which we all know you're not, because you're not going to remember it.
You're not going to remember it. And even if you did, you would wash them,
right?
Which also spends resources.
Yes, exactly.
So we end up hurting the environment, but feeling good with ourselves.
Exactly. And that's what the environmental movement has become, is a feel-good movement, not a do-good movement. And there's so much wrong with this kind of like virtue signaling policy that the left has largely proposed. I mean, I lived in Seattle for 6 years, and they banned plastic bags and plastic straws as well. So I looked into what actual impact does that have. 95% of the plastic in our ocean comes from like 10 rivers in Asia. So 95% of the plastic in the ocean comes from 10 rivers in Asia, okay? So that means the 5% is the rest of the world, and every other river in the rest of the world, including Asia, contributes to that small 5%.
Where are these rivers? In which countries?
They're going through multiple. India, they're going through Indonesia, they're going through China. It's multiple different countries, and it's mostly developing countries.
Yeah,
and
but it's a handful of places. Like, it's not our fault. We don't.
Right, exactly.
We are not going to solve it.
Banning straws or plastic bags in the United States, like, that doesn't make a difference. Look, it's not going to hurt the environment to have less plastic straws and less paper bags less plastic bags in the ocean, but it's not. Like, all of our attention shouldn't be going to these mandates, and it actually doesn't make that big of an impact. And in a lot of cases, it can backfire because every environmental solution that we pursue has a trade-off, and that's what these environmentalists don't realize. When you ban plastic bags and you implement paper bags are better from basically a plastic pollution perspective. But it takes way more energy to create those. Right. You're obviously cutting down trees still. Right. And it is more expensive.
In many cases, it costs more for the small businesses.
It does.
Destroys jobs.
It does.
My parents had a restaurant in Spain, and Spain did this. And they had to switch all their plastic straws. And I know it sounds stupid because it's, just the straws, who cares? Well, it was triple the price. And it's not just one mandate. It's mandates in every sphere.
So those costs just get passed on to us, the consumer. So not only is it not really helping the environment, right? Because the paper bags use more energy, and actually a plastic bag, if we're going to focus on that for a second, a plastic bag is worse from an ocean pollution perspective than any other alternative.
Okay.
But it is the least carbon intensive out of all the options. A reusable bag, a paper bag, all use infinitely more carbon to create. So if you care about climate change, then actually plastic bags are a much, much better option. And not only that, but they're cheaper and they are far more accessible. There's a reason why in poor areas in the United States, you still see plastic bags everywhere because it's the cheapest option. And those stores and those communities cannot afford. So to your point with your parents, this is a perfect example where not only did this policy not really help the environment to ban these things, but it also has put people's lives at risk in a way that is not necessary. And so that's why I'm trying to build an environmental movement that is basically the opposite of that.
Yeah, and it's not even about left and right. I think it's about smart versus ignorant.
Yes, it is. It's also impact versus unnecessary top-down regulation, feel-good virtue signaling. Like, the policies that have been proposed either don't work, backfire, or aren't possible. So Nothing, I would say, honestly, nothing. So our world has become so much cleaner in the United States than it was in previous decades. We're at the same emissions level per capita in this country that we were in 1913. We've gone back over a century to reduce our emissions.
And going down.
So we're continuing to go down. We'll be below that very soon. I would not put any of that success on these policies. None. I'd put it on the market innovating. I'd put it on innovative technology like Elon Musk and other entrepreneurs in this country that have made it easier to be clean, cheaper to be clean. I would put it on our shift from coal to natural gas as an energy source. And I would put it on our willingness as Americans to embrace efficiency and the fact that efficiency saves us money, but it also makes us consume less resources. That's not the government's success. These mandates are not the reason that we're improving the environment. And that doesn't mean that there's not a role for government. But the left approach of government first, these kind of virtue signaling things, is not making a difference.
Now, from the same vein of the left-wing environmentalists that want to make us poorer in order to supposedly protect the environment, I think there's also a movement that has tried to be in the right from environmentalists who actually, there are organizations whose explicit goal, like say Numbers USA, their name is Numbers USA because they want a smaller number of Americans. They think that if we had fewer people, fewer immigrants, fewer native-born babies, then we would hurt the environment less. We'll preserve it, right?
Yeah.
What do you think of this? Is there something to the argument that there's overpopulation or more people actually hurts the environment?
So I don't think it's anyone's decision to tell people who should and shouldn't have kids. And it's up to each individual to decide that for themselves. And so to say that we need more or less people, I don't think is the right conversation. We need to make it work regardless. If our world wants to have 4 billion people in 150 or in multiple centuries because we're producing less people, then we got to make that work. If it's going to be 12, 15 billion, then we got to make that work too. Like we have to be able to find a way to manage our ecosystem while also dealing with the realities of how many people we have. And I do not believe too many people I don't think that situation poses a massive risk to the environment, because per person, we're decreasing our drain on resources so substantially in this country and across the world that I don't see a scenario where if we continue to increase our population as a world that would put that much harm on our environment, because we're becoming so much better at stewarding ourselves and our resources. But again, I just feel like it's so wrong for people to say, oh, we need to decrease the population to X amount. That's so immoral and so inhumane. And it's also so disingenuous to tell people that a lower population means a better environment. Because with more people, as many, Elon Musk and many others have been talking about, come more good ideas, come more innovative technologies, come more efficiency measures that we can implement. That's not going to happen with less people. And either way, we're going to have a lot of people. So we might as well have people who want to solve these problems and not people who are telling you that you shouldn't exist.
If the U.S. hadn't allowed Elon Musk to immigrate to the United States, we would have one fewer American, but we wouldn't have Tesla, we wouldn't have SpaceX, we wouldn't have.
And he's just one example of. He's the biggest example, but he's one example of literally millions of Americans who have come up with really cool solutions to environmental challenges. So that's not going to happen if people think that they don't have a role in this, and if they think that they should just be dead. Like our generation, the millennials and Gen Z, feel so hopeless and fearful for the future because they feel like climate change is going to basically destroy our lives. What I tell young people is that this challenge of environmental protection and kind of this pairing of humanity with the environment, this challenge is probably the biggest challenge of our lifetime from a longevity standpoint. And that means that we have an obligation to come up with the solutions, to be the entrepreneurs, to be the ones who innovate. And by sitting on the sidelines and being fearful and thinking that we should be guilty of being here, we're never going to solve those problems.
Yeah.
So as our generation continues to grow up, we need to be instilling this inspiration that yes, we have this challenge, but it's going to be met, and it's going to be met through really creative people.
Now, Benji, in the conservative movement, there's also a lot of people who think, and I think that there's some credit to this argument that, look, the planet is heating, is warming.
Yep.
But really, there's nothing we can do about it from the United States. I read this. I don't know if this is true because it's not really my issue of focus. I feel like this is much more scientific. That if the U.S. stopped all carbon emissions today, the planet would basically still warm at almost the same rate for the next 100 years.
That's true.
So then, is the solution to, I think, probably the biggest threat of global warming, and I'm not even taking a position over like what's the share that's human or not, but planet is warming, that's a fact, and the poles are losing their ice, so the sea levels are rising, and that does pose a threat to coastal cities in the U.S. and around the world.
Yep.
Then how do we deal with this issue?
So there's multiple layers of this. So I'll first talk about kind of the role that the United States plays. I think our role, because to your point, we don't have the control over the global temperature meter, and we also don't have control over the emissions of the world. We have a little over 10% of the carbon emissions of the world. So if you reduced our carbon footprint completely, we would only be reducing emissions worldwide by 10%. So if that's true, then I think what we should be doing in America is trying to come up with sustainable solutions that lower pollution, but that also improve people's lives. Because if you're looking at China, India, other developing countries that are increasing their emissions pretty substantially, the only way that they will implement pro-environmental solutions is if it makes sense for them economically, and if it makes the developed countries, if it makes the underdeveloped countries developed. If you're trying to impose some sort of like clean solution that's expensive, they will never do it. So the United States should be trying to do that for ourselves because it'll help us, but we should also be trying to showcase to other countries that they can do that too, because there's no point in trying to push them to do anything different. So that's kind of the first part of it. The second part of it is that carbon emissions do have a significant impact on the warming climate that we're experiencing. However, there are also a lot of natural, parts of that. If we stopped all carbon emissions, our world would still be warming. Right. So the reality is...
Oh, wait, are you saying that if all humans in the planet stopped carbon emissions?
If all human contributions to carbon emissions stopped overnight, we'd still experience a warming climate.
Okay.
Because of just natural climate change cycles. So we're contributing to a natural climate change cycle.
Okay.
So it's both. And so the point is, the world goes through these changes all the time, and humanity needs to adapt. Because even if we don't have an impact, we still need to adapt. It honestly was kind of foolish. It's too late to change course now, but it was kind of foolish for New York, Boston, Miami to build themselves literally at sea level or even below. Like New York and Boston were literally just propped up.
That's the history of humanity. See, people need to trade in the seas. They didn't know.
We kind of screwed up. So the point is that's always going to be a problem, no matter if carbon emissions are contributing or not. And so we have to adapt. We have to build seawalls. We have to build natural ecosystems that can prevent against, hurricanes and storm damage. If the United States or the world is not emitting carbon into the atmosphere, we're still going to have hurricanes. We're still going to have, sea level rise and different tides, and we have to be prepared for those things. So adaptation to these problems is critical.
Yeah, and, with the adaptation in mind, I've thought about this a lot, and I think it's coming up now. I mean, environmental issues are really hitting Florida really hard now with the whole insurance crisis.
Yeah.
The risk of floods are going up, the risk of hurricanes. Many things are happening. And so environmentalism, and I guess this is the idea that you want to bring forth with your book, that environmentalism isn't just about the temperature of the world and isn't just about mandates. It's about really down-to-earth issues. How do we solve the insurance crisis in Florida? How
Right.
do we solve the floods that happen every time there's a storm in New York City? And it's not about taxes or government regulations. It's a lot about just regular people at action.
Exactly. And to hone in on that for a second, it's about people's backyards. Like, how do you solve each complex environmental challenge piece by piece? It's like somebody who's dealing with insurance problem with their home in Florida is dealing with a totally different problem than somebody who's living in Seattle or someone who's living in Wisconsin. So when we have the government telling us that we need the same solution for all those areas, they need to implement the exact same measures, they need to have the exact same energy sources, those sorts of things, it's just not right. What we need to be focusing on, to your point, is each localized solution is different. How can we equip the people there on the ground to make the best decision for them? And how can we lean on local leadership instead of trying to tell people what they can and can't do? Because the people who know how to take care of their backyards best are the ones who are in the front yard and the people who are actually dealing with those problems day in and day out. And there are so many localized challenges that every community faces on the environment that the federal government does not know how to solve.
So on that note, I think most people don't know that a huge portion of the west of the United States is owned by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean the national parks.
Right.
I mean the Bureau of Land Management and the Bureau of Forest Management.
Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service.
And they own, I think, like 90% of the state of Nevada, which is just desert. It's not like this is land that is being preserved for,
Right.
some beautiful reason or people visit it. No, nothing like that.
Right.
So what should we do about the federal lands?
That's a really good question. It's very complex, too, because national parks are a big part of this country's heritage and legacy. I think it's one of the most unanimous things that Americans agree on is how much the national parks mean to them and how much...
And didn't your organization help with this bill on national parks?
Yeah, it's a great point. We helped fund the national park backlog, which there was a $13 billion deficit in our national parks. And in fact, when you went to a national park, you pay the entrance fee. It wasn't actually going to the national park. It was going to a general government fund. And so these parks couldn't use if they had 1,000 tourists come in a weekend, they couldn't use any of that money to help rebuild their...
I think nobody actually knew that when they were entering. I think everybody thought
Everyone
that their
thought
fee went to that.
I remember my dad would be like, hey, we're going to go, I have no problem paying this $35 because it's going right to the park and preserving this land. It's like, nope, actually not at all. And no one really knew that. And we changed that, which was great. And we also helped an existing tax stream from oil and gas companies to be, so no taxes were raised, but we pointed that money towards the National Park Service. So now those parks are funded to upgrade their infrastructure, upgrade their roads, their visitor centers, all those different things, and also to keep the trails and the parks happy. So the problem with that is that you were relying on the government to fund something that every American supports, and they still couldn't do it, right? It was still $13 billion in debt. So you think about what happens to our Forest Service and our Bureau of Land Management. The Forest Service has become a place where they basically have that preservationist mindset that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
And that has resulted in massive forest fires because they aren't actively managing these forests. They kind of have this hands-off mentality.
Can you explain what active forest management means?
Yeah, so active forest management is basically the idea that if there's a lot of dead brush or dead trees or trees that are too close together, that if there are all those problems and a lightning strike hits or somebody's baby gender reveal goes wrong and a forest fire starts, that it's going to be infinitely worse because you didn't manage it. And there's actually, forests have cycles of health, and wildlife need all those cycles to survive. So like when a place is clear cut for forest management, people think, oh, that's really, really bad. And a lot of times it is. But a lot of the time, that's actually what the wildlife need for their ecosystem to thrive. And so this forest management is basically looking at an entire forest and saying, what does it need? Is there too much dead brush? Are the trees too close together? Do we need to clear a little bit so that there's a little bit of space between things? And
it's thinking long term rather than short term.
It is, and it's again this conservation mindset. So because the U.S. Forest Service is not doing that, forest fires are so much worse.
So the U.S. Forest Service doesn't clear forests to avoid wildfires?
That's right.
At all?
No.
Wow.
And
they never have, or is that a new thing?
They have decreasingly done so since the early 1900s. They started doing it a lot, and then when Native Americans do it, so many, it's a very proven practice. This hands-off mentality is very new. It's like basically since like the Lorax. Think about the Lorax from Dr. Seuss. It makes it seem like anybody who's trying to mess with the forests is the enemy, and it sounds really bad to the general public, so they don't want to do it. And they're scared of the general public's reaction.
Right.
So it is sort of a recent thing, and it does not work, and it's proven to not work. And there's a reason why we're having less fires overall, but so much more acreage burned. And it's because every time there is a fire, it's just really, really bad.
I think in your new post op-ed, you mentioned that it wasn't the California wildfire that happened that was preventable, and it emitted more, just that wildfire, more carbon emissions than 25 million cars over a year.
Yes, exactly.
So more cars than the Biden administration is going to get out with billions of dollars in electric car subsidies could have been prevented with one less wildfire.
That's right. And that wildfire also overshadowed the California for about the 10 years before that had reduced carbon emissions by a certain amount. That wildfire erased all of it. So all the progress they had made by forcing things down people's throats and transitioning to other energy sources, which I talk about in the book, way too quickly and way too costly, all that stuff, all that was worth nothing because of this one wildfire. So there are some really simple solutions that we can rally behind that people could really get excited about, not because they are crazy and they change the world's temperature, but because they actually just make sense. Like,
tell me about some of those solutions.
Yeah, I mean, so forest management's the easiest example, and we just talked about that. Another example is keeping our nuclear reactors open.
They're trying to close them.
They're trying to close them in New York. They're trying to close them in California. New York was successful in closing its nuclear plant, and emissions have skyrocketed.
Wow.
And energy costs have gone up, and it was all because people were scared of nuclear, and it was actually environmental activists that prevented that. And California's doing the same thing. Now, what people don't realize is that by keeping those open, not only are we using existing infrastructure and it makes sense economically, but it also is the cleanest energy source we have.
Right.
And to replace a nuclear plant in this country, it would take 3 million solar panels.
What?
So you'd have to put 3 million solar panels somewhere to equate to one nuclear plant.
And I've also seen, I think people who promote solar energy also forget. I mean, solar energy has many good things, and like put it in your roof in your house. I think fantastic, put it in your roofs. But we are actually occupying vast amounts of land that could be used for other purposes too, solely for solar panels. And I do think that that's a cost that needs to be traded off.
100%. And there are so many more trade-offs to solar and wind than people think. And I mean, solar, the mining is really, really negative. I mean, we're destroying ecosystems all over the world.
But it's okay because it's outside of the United States.
Exactly. Out of sight, out of mind. And there's a reason why every project to mine for solar panels in the United States is told not to happen because it is really bad for the environment. I mean, we could mine here in the United States for these solar panels, but no one wants it in their backyard because it looks bad and it destroys the environment. But if we're not doing it here, someone else is doing it, and it's destroying their environment instead of ours. So I think from an environmental standpoint, going back to your solutions question, we need to be looking at things in terms of trade-offs. Like, if we do this here, what happens somewhere else? If we do this here, what happens to our economy? If we do this here, what happens? Try to balance all these things. And if we implement 100% electric vehicles, what does that take? How much do we,
I didn't know this, but electric vehicles are heavier than gas-powered vehicles, and it would be terrible for the roads, and then it will cost us so much more money to upgrade them.
So there's all these realities that people don't think about, and like electric vehicles sounds really nice, right? Like
it does, yeah.
It does sound really nice, and they're fun to drive and all that stuff. Like, and we can't dismiss the importance of electric vehicles as part of the future, but to act like they're this perfect thing, to act like solar panels are these perfect things.
Or that the government should spend more on electric vehicles subsidies than food stamps.
Right. It's plain wrong. And it doesn't make environmental sense right now at all. So I think like forest fires, preventing them makes sense, right? And it intuitively makes sense. And keeping nuclear plants open makes sense. And there's this reality, how AOC talked about cow farts and banning cow farts, right?
Because so that people know the methane that from cows really and really cattle in general is a huge contributor to carbon emissions.
Well, that's what they think. 70% of methane in the United States comes from natural gas. So agriculture is only a small percentage. It's not even the rest of the 30. There's a couple other categories. So if you really want to tackle the methane problem in the United States, other than having us all fart a little less, you would basically there are these orphaned natural gas wells all over the United States of basically abandoned oil and gas facilities that are leaking methane because they've been abandoned. They're called orphaned wells, and they have these kind of openings that are leaking methane.
And they're allowed to do that?
There currently is really no regulation or standard to make them not do that. So these companies go and just ditch these production sites. And if you were able to just plug that well, plug the orphaned well is what they call it, you'd be able to offset almost all of the methane in the United States.
What's the cost of plugging a well?
It depends on how big the well is, so it varies substantially, but it's something that all the companies can afford, and they have the capacity to do this. And in fact, a lot of the companies have been starting to do this, and they're advocating for the government to put in a law that makes it so that they have to do it.
Well, I will say, I mean, maybe some companies want that because they want to stop their competitors.
Exactly.
Right? Because, the U.S. also has a lot of individual, especially with fracking, a lot of small oil drillers. Yep. So maybe it's a bigger cost for them, but it's still something that I think we should definitely explore.
Yes, and the cost is fairly marginal. It's basically a one-time thing. You can plug it and it's pretty much plugged. So there are some really easy solutions that we could pursue right now in this country that, they're not like transformational, but they make a huge difference, and they either are neutral to people's pocketbooks or they benefit people's pocketbooks. And
the forest management also saves lives.
And saves a lot of money, and saves a lot of lives, saves a lot of homes, saves a lot of communities. And also saves the ecosystems that we'd love to explore. There's nothing more, discouraging than hiking through a burned forest. Like it feels like a doomsday scenario.
A wildfire in California almost burns both the Ronald Reagan Ranch and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And it was because the Ronald Reagan Ranch is now owned by Young America's Foundation that I partner with very many times. And they have privately owned the ranch and all the surroundings of the mountain for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And they've done forest management on their own land, and they saved the ranch because of that.
Yes. And there are so many examples of that. That's incredible. I didn't even realize that they did that. But most wildfires slow down in terms of their intensity and scale because they get butt up against some private landowner who's done a really good job, and that private landowner slows it down because they've actually managed their forest. So they're like, if it wasn't for private landowners, wildfires would be so much worse, and they're already way worse than they need to be.
Okay, so we've talked about several solutions: the forest management, nuclear, the plugging the orphan wells, obviously, private ownership of land, things like that. I wanted to bring up some good things that happen. The recent news that we discovered these rare earths minerals that are important for clean energy in Nevada, right?
Yep.
Can you tell me or explain to listeners what happened?
Yeah, so basically there's this ever-increasing demand for rare earth minerals, which make up everything that we use on a day-to-day basis, from cell phones to computers to tablets to solar panels and EV batteries. And Nevada is home to this massive deposit of so many different minerals that we use for everything in our day-to-day lives. We have been 90% of our solar panel materials, 90% of our EV battery materials come from overseas right now. And so onshoring that to the United States is something that could really help from multiple standpoints, right? There are obviously jobs and economic opportunities in that industry. Also, not helping our adversaries by
China
having China send us their minerals instead. That would help. And we also have better environmental standards here in the United States. And then, of course, the transportation costs of, shipping, millions and millions of tons of this material overseas is no small feat, and takes a lot of coal on ships to.
No, and our ports in the West are really backlogged, and it's a huge problem.
Exactly. So this is a huge opportunity for the United States to take a lead on mineral production. The issue that I see is, because we care so much about our environment and our property rights, we have so many complicated measures that you have to go through before you mine. And this reserve of minerals below, ground that they found, this is, it spans public land, private land. Public land also means state land sometimes.
Tribal
land. And of course, the tribes don't want that. It's a huge problem. And I don't know how they're going to figure that out. Because, again, to your point earlier, no one really wants these things in their backyards. Even if we
I believe the private landowners definitely want it in their backyard because they're going to make a lot of money.
That's true. They do. But I read that it's only 10% privately owned.
But I did read that it was worth over $1 trillion. Like the total number of all the rare earths minerals on today's prices. That's a lot.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how much it's worth. I didn't see that part, but it's no small mine. This would be a massive operation, but again, we might as well do it here. And I talk about that a lot in the book, is like, we've offshored this all overseas and refused to do it here, and our environment's actually way worse off. So if we can do this in Nevada and show the world that we're back, baby, we're ready to be a part of the clean energy revolution in our own way instead of importing it all, our environment will be better off and our economy will be better off as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned all the permits, right? The NEPA.
Yeah,
that's the big environmental law. Can you explain what NEPA is and how it's actually worse for the environment?
Yeah, so NEPA is, this complex process to get a project like a mine, or really any project off the ground that's energy related or that would have an environmental impact. And the permitting process, due to the government sucking per usual, takes 10 years to complete for these projects. So, for example, on something like offshore wind or a mine in Minnesota, it will take 8 to 10 years just to get the permit approved. With mining, it's not as big of a deal technologically, but like with offshore wind, every few years, you're dealing with new technology, new energy needs, all that stuff. So a permit that you applied for 10 years ago might not even be relevant today. And so you basically missed the opportunity. But you've also, if we want to take this stuff back from China, from a mining or an offshore wind or whatever perspective, we don't have 10 years to wait.
And if we just want cheaper energy, cheaper electricity, cheaper services,
we have
cheaper
to start
cars.
working towards it now. We can't wait 10 years. So it's a huge hurdle to America leading on environmental protection, because we have this environmental law that's kind of hiding behind this reality that it's actually not pro-environment at all.
And also, it's not just that it delays a project by 10 years. Is that a lot of projects simply aren't profitable if they're not making money in the first 10 years.
Exactly.
So they just never happen.
And what company in the United States or abroad is going to want to invest in that? Like if you know that you can build an offshore wind or a nuclear or a mine in 1 to 2 years or whatever, but the government's going to take 10.
Yeah. So
make it take 10. Why would you ever financially invest in that as an investor?
I don't know if you saw the news about this. I think it was the French railway company that they were going to build a train or something in Texas. And they're like, guys, the permitting is just too much. We're just going to do it in Morocco.
Exactly.
And they did it in Morocco.
Exactly.
Morocco, a poor country.
Yes. So all these companies in the United States and abroad are investing elsewhere because of that process. And the NEPA process is super, super harmful.
Wow. Well, I think that you've given us a really cool perspective about what's going on with the environment. I want to talk a little bit about your book too, directly, because I know a lot of this is covered in your book. Tell me, well, first, why did you write your book now?
I wrote this now because I think it's 20 years too late. Conservatives haven't had a voice on these issues for the last 20 years, and there's really been no leader on the forefront trying to lead on this issue. And there's no book, there's no resource, there's just nothing for conservatives who care about the environment or about how conservatives can engage in a way that's authentic to them. So this is the first book that's been done, and I really wish it had been done sooner. So I was just trying to do this in as quick of a timeline as I could because it's been long overdue. But I also think that over the last 7 years of building ACC's movement, I've realized that the environmental movement of, as we know, of the left isn't working. And it's not working for us as humans. We all know that. I would think most people who are watching or listening to this know that. But it's also not working for our environment. And I care deeply, as we talked about at the beginning, about the environment. And so if we want to protect the environment, we need a different approach. And that's the approach I outlined. So my goal is to give conservatives a resource and give people a resource to understanding a new approach, but also to help usher in that new approach and have people who read it be a part of the movement to build a sustainable environment that's also good for our economy and everything that we've talked about today. So it was a true privilege to write it, and I'm hoping it'll make the splash that I think it needs to for the sake of the environment and for conservatism, because we're obviously losing on this issue.
Yeah, right. I think you talk a lot about this, about how young Americans care a lot about the environment.
Yep.
And really the only party that is talking about the environment, conservation, about anything related to that is the Democrats.
Yep.
And as a consequence, your argument is that a lot of people are going to vote for them, and so we need to engage. I think I do the same thing on many issues. I think that, who has a plan on student debt, who has a plan on healthcare? For the Democrats, it's a very easy plan. I'll just give free healthcare. I'll just forgive your student debt. And then Republicans don't have a plan that they've actually been able to tackle on how do we lower healthcare costs? How do we change our college education systems?
What do we end up with? We end up with Biden forgiving student loan debt, and we end up with Obamacare. We end up with these things because we don't provide an alternative. We end up with open borders. We end up with the Green New Deal mentality. That's what we end up with. So you either get to the table or you lose. And with this book, I'm trying to get us back to the table.
Tell me, if you had to say in a very short time, 30 seconds or 1 minute, what does a conservative environmentalist believe in?
A conservative environmentalist believes that our environment is worth protecting, but not at the expense of humanity and our ability to thrive. And we believe that to do that, you can pursue pro-economic, pro-market ideas that are innovative and make our country and our world a better place because they make our lives easier and they lower costs and they improve the quality of life. And if we pursue that agenda, that we will all be better off, and that we have an obligation as conservatives to do that because we love our country and we love our neighborhoods and we love the incredible earth that has been given to us by God. We are going to protect that because we have that obligation, and that conservative environmentalism is the way to do it.
Benji Backer, the conservative environmentalist, thanks so much.
One of many. Thank you so much.
Great, man. This was another episode of Manhattan Insights. If you liked what you heard today, remember to subscribe to our podcast and like in whichever platform you listen to.